The Syrian sun had already turned the forward operating base into a blast furnace by the time Hospital Corpsman Second Class Reese Donovan stepped off the C-130 transport. Heat waves shimmered across the tarmac like water distorting the landscape into something alien and unforgiving. She shouldered her medical kit and walked toward the cluster of prefabricated buildings that would be home for the next 6 months, each step taking her further from the person she'd been and closer to someone she couldn't yet imagine becoming. The briefing room felt 20 degrees cooler, but carried its own kind of heat. 8 men watched her enter with the predatory stillness of apex predators assessing potential prey. These weren't the polished warriors from recruitment posters. These were operators ground down by too many deployments, carrying exhaustion like a second skin and wearing their skepticism like armor. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Kessler stood at the head of the conference table, tactical maps spread before him like topographical prayers. At 35, he possessed the coiled readiness of someone who'd survived situations that should have killed him. His face showed weathering beyond his years, sun damage and stress lines carving a roadmap of conflicts that didn't appear on any official record. When he finally acknowledged her presence, his voice carried the flat affect of a man delivering news nobody wanted to hear. "We requested Sullivan back." The statement hung in the air like an accusation. Reese had studied Aaron Sullivan's file during the flight from Germany, 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts, a reputation for keeping SEALs alive in situations that shattered lesser medics. Impossible boots to fill, and every face in the room confirmed they knew it. Chief Petty Officer Garrett Sloan leaned against the far wall, muscular arms crossed over his chest. A barely healed scar traced from his left temple to his jawline, the tissue still pink and angry against weathered skin. At 34, he should have been in his prime, but something behind his eyes suggested he'd already lived several lifetimes' worth of violence. His fingers drummed an unconscious rhythm against his bicep, working out stiffness that never quite disappeared. Petty Officer Marcus Webb, barely 22, but trying desperately to project veteran confidence, kept flexing his right hand. The movement was compulsive, constant, like checking to make sure damaged tendons still function. Petty Officer First Class Owen Holt, the communications specialist, studied her with the careful neutrality of someone reserving judgment. 2 other operators watched from corners, shadows with names she'd learn later if she survived long enough to matter. "Sullivan set a high bar," Reese said, meeting Kessler's stare without flinching. Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd already proven herself under fire, even if these particular warriors hadn't witnessed it. "I'm not here to replace him. I'm here to do my job and keep you all breathing long enough to go home to your families." The tension stretched like overwound wire until Holt broke it with a dry chuckle. "Well, at least she's not blowing sunshine about being the best medic in the Navy." The comment earned grudging smiles, but Reese recognized probation when she saw it. What she couldn't see yet was the weight these men carried. Guilt settled into their bones like shrapnel surgeons couldn't extract. That first week unfolded as a careful dance between professional competence and personal boundaries. During training exercises, she demonstrated medical skills with the precision that came from treating real casualties under real fire. When Sloan deliberately pushed the pace during a conditioning run, clearly testing her physical limits, she kept up without complaint despite sweat pouring down her face in the relentless Syrian heat. She'd grown up on a Montana ranch where weakness meant dead cattle and failed harvests. She'd learned early that complaining changed nothing. The cracks in the team's foundation revealed themselves in small moments. The way Webb kept working his damaged hand chasing full function, that surgery and physical therapy promised, but never quite delivered. The way Kessler sometimes stared at empty chairs during briefings, jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. The way nobody ever mentioned Sullivan's name as if speaking it aloud might summon ghosts they weren't ready to face. On her 5th day, Reese found Sloan alone in the armory, methodically cleaning a Barrett M82A1 with the reverent attention most men reserved for religious relics. The rifle was a monster designed to punch through engine blocks and concrete barriers at distances that turned human targets into abstract concepts rather than flesh and blood. "That's some rifle," she said from the doorway. Sloan didn't look up from his work. Sullivan could shoot, made expert marksman with this beauty at 800 meters. Wind elevation, temperature, he factored it all faster than most people can read a ballistics chart. But now Sloan did look up, and something in his expression made Reese wish she'd stayed silent. But he couldn't shoot away the things he'd seen, the people he'd saved, the ones he couldn't. His fingers traced the scar on his face like reading Braille. "This Eid in Kandahar. Sullivan had me stable in 90 seconds. Saved my life." He set down the cleaning cloth with deliberate care. Then he saved Webb when shrapnel turned his hand into hamburger. Then Holt when a firefight went sideways and half his blood ended up painting Syrian sand. Sloane's voice had gone quiet, almost gentle. We lost 2 men on our last mission. Ambush outside Raqqa. Medical support arrived too late, but Sullivan was already there. He tried everything. Chest compressions until his hands bled. Emergency tracheotomy with a ballpoint pen. Kept working even after they were gone. Like if he just didn't give up, maybe they'd come back. The senior chief began reassembling the Barrett with mechanical precision. 3 months ago, Sullivan walked into the equipment shed, sat down on a crate of MRIs, and put his service pistol in his mouth. Night Watch found him 6 hours later. Command called it accidental discharge during weapons maintenance, but we all knew. We'd watched him getting quieter, more distant, like he was already gone and just forgot to take his body with him. Ice water ran down Reese's spine. The file had said Sullivan rotated stateside. Medical discharge for undisclosed reasons. Nothing about a bullet and a lie to spare his family the truth. Does Kessler know you told me this? Kessler's the one who found him. Sloane's hands never stopped moving, muscle memory taking over. Sullivan was like a son to him. Trained him, mentored him, trusted him with the team's lives. Then watched him break apart piece by piece and didn't know how to stop it. That's why he's cold to you, Donovan. It's not personal. He just can't afford to care about another medic who might not make it. That night, Reese lay in her bunk, staring at ceiling panels and listening to distant artillery fire. She thought about Sullivan sitting alone in that equipment shed surrounded by tools of war, deciding the only way to stop the memories was to stop everything. She thought about Kessler finding him making the call lying to investigators. She thought about warriors who'd learned to trust their medic completely, only to have him vanish in the worst way possible. The responsibility felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. 2 weeks into deployment, dynamics shifted in ways both subtle and significant. Kessler still watched her with calculating assessment, but now a flicker of something hope maybe lurked beneath the skepticism. The team had begun including her in informal conversations, testing her knowledge with questions that seemed casual, but were actually sophisticated evaluations of combat readiness. Then came the Friday night that changed everything. Marcus Webb stumbled into the aid station at 0200 with what was clearly a bar fight injury masquerading as equipment malfunction. The gash above his left eye needed 12 stitches, his knuckles were split and swollen, and he reeked of alcohol and cheap perfume. By regulation, she should have reported the incident, disciplinary action, potentially removed from the team career in jeopardy. Reese looked at the young operator, trying to hold himself together through sheer willpower and failing. Webb had the kind of face that still showed hints of the teenager he'd been 3 years ago before the Navy turned him into a weapon and deployed him to places that didn't appear on maps. Equipment malfunction, huh? She pulled on latex gloves and began cleaning the wound with methodical precision. Must have been some piece of equipment. Webb winced as she irrigated the cut, but his eyes showed desperate hope she might not destroy his career. Yeah, real defective piece of gear. Won't happen again. I'm sure it won't. Reese threaded the suture needle with practiced ease. Tell me about your brother. The question caught him off guard. What? Your brother, the one whose medical bills put you $30,000 in debt to a loan shark who just happened to be at the same bar tonight. The one who died anyway, despite everything you tried to do for him. Webb's face went white. How did you? I read the police report from the fight. Guy you hit filed charges, then mysteriously dropped them 2 hours later. But not before describing in detail how you owed him money and he was just collecting what's due. 22-year-old Navy SEAL doesn't rack up that kind of debt from gambling. Not unless something catastrophic happened. She began stitching with the kind of neat, precise technique that minimized scarring. Webb stared at the far wall jaw, working like he was chewing words he didn't want to say. Leukemia, he finally said. Diagnosed at 19. Insurance covered some, but experimental treatments aren't exactly budget-friendly. I took out loans. Lots of loans. He died 6 months ago, and debt collectors don't care about dead brothers. Reese finished the final suture and applied sterile dressing. That guy at the bar was threatening you. Said if you didn't pay up, he'd contact command, get you dishonorably discharged. Make sure your family lost at everything. Yeah. Webb's voice had gone hollow. So I hit him. Kept hitting him until his friends pulled me off. Real professional. She made notes in his medical record that would support the equipment malfunction story, then looked him directly in the eye. You get help or I report next time. There are programs, financial counseling, debt consolidation. The Navy takes care of its own, but you have to let them. Your brother's gone Webb. Don't follow him by destroying yourself over money. Relief and shame wore across his face. Sullivan covered for me, too. Different thing, but same principle. He told me everyone carries weight they shouldn't have to carry alone. Then 3 months later, Webb didn't finish. He didn't need to. Sullivan carried too many secrets, Reese said quietly. Too much weight from too many people. That's not going to be me, which means you get actual help, not just my discretion. Deal, deal. Word of her discretion spread through the team like wildfire. By weekend's end, the dynamic shift was palpable. She wasn't just competent, she understood the unwritten rules governing their brotherhood. She could be trusted not just with their lives, but with their secrets, mistakes, and humanity. Monday morning, Kessler found her in the medical supply room doing inventory. He leaned against the doorframe, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Webb's equipment malfunction was remarkably convenient timing, he said. No inflection, just stating facts. Reese didn't look up from her clipboard. Accidents happen, Commander, especially with substandard gear. Indeed, a long pause. Sullivan used to do the same thing, cover for the team when they needed covering. Write creative reports that protected careers while maintaining medical accuracy. He was good at it. Too good. Now she did look up. Is that what killed him, carrying everyone else's burdens? Kessler's expression hardened. What killed Sullivan was believing that being a good medic meant saving everyone, that every loss was personal failure, that showing weakness meant letting down the team. He straightened up, military bearing, returning. I won't make that mistake with you, Donovan. You see something breaking, you report it. You feel yourself breaking, you report it. Clear, crystal, sir. He turned to leave, then paused. There's a training block this afternoon. 1,600 hours. Bring your shooting gloves. The Syrian sun was brutal at 4 in the afternoon, turning metal on the shooting range into branding irons. Kessler waited at the far end with the Barrett already set up on a stable platform, its massive profile unmistakable, even at distance. Sullivan could shoot, he said, without preamble when she arrived. Qualified expert marksman on 7 different weapon systems. The Barrett was his favorite. Said it was the most honest weapon in the inventory. Either you hit what you're aiming at or you don't. No middle ground. Reese approached the rifle with appropriate respect. Growing up on a Montana ranch meant she'd learned to shoot before she learned to drive. Her father had taught her on a lever-action Winchester hunting elk in high country, where a clean kill meant the difference between meat for winter and a wounded animal suffering in snow. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran, had refined her technique, teaching her that marksmanship was precision medicine applied at distance. Same steady hands, same controlled breathing, same focus on the target. But this was different. The Barrett wasn't designed for hunting. It was designed for destroying things at ranges that turned human beings into mathematical abstractions. Range is 400 meters, Kessler said, gesturing toward distant targets. Wind is minimal, but present. Temperature affects ballistics. Elevation matters. The Barrett's got significant recoil, so be ready. Reese settled into position behind the rifle, feeling its weight and balance. The scope brought the distant target into sharp focus, and muscle memory from 1,000 hunting trips took over. Controlled breathing, natural point of aim, sight picture, trigger control. The same fundamentals her grandfather had drilled into her during countless pre-dawn mornings in Montana wilderness. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder, the report deafening, despite ear protection. Through the scope, she saw the bullet impact dead center on target. She worked the bolt, chambering another round, and fired again. Another hit, this time slightly right of center. A third shot corrected left. By the 5th round, she'd found her rhythm, adjusting for the weapon's characteristics and environmental factors that tried to pull bullets off course. When she finished, Kessler studied the target through high-powered binoculars without comment. The silence stretched long enough to make her wonder if she'd somehow failed a test she hadn't known she was taking. Finally, he spoke. Sullivan practiced on this rifle for 6 months before I trusted him to carry it on mission. You just qualified expert in 15 minutes. His eyes, the color of Arctic ice, found hers, and for the first time she saw something other than skepticism. Where did you learn to shoot like that? My grandfather, she said simply. He always said the best hunters are the ones who never miss when it matters. Kessler nodded, slowly confirming something he'd suspected. Rodriguez, our previous comms specialist, before Holt asked Sullivan once why he spent so much time on the range. Sullivan told him it was because taking a life required perfect certainty. If you're going to end someone's existence, you owe them the precision to do it right. No suffering, no mistakes, just clean and final. He began breaking down the Barrett movements, efficient and practiced. I'm putting you through advanced marksmanship training. You'll qualify on the M4, the M110, and maintain proficiency on the Barrett. Not because I expect you to use it in combat, but because I want you to understand what my operators go through. The weight of the weapon, the burden of the shot, the responsibility of taking human life at distance. Sir, I'm a medic. My job is to save lives, not your job is to be part of this team. His voice carried steel beneath calm exterior. Sullivan was the best damn medic I ever worked with, and he fell apart because he only saw one side of the equation. He saved lives but never understood the cost of taking them. When he finally had to make that choice, it broke something in him he couldn't fix. Kessler shouldered the rifle case and started walking back toward base. I won't let that happen to you, Donovan. You're going to understand every aspect of what we do out here. The healing and the killing, the saving and the sacrificing, all of it. Because when the moment comes, and it will come, you need to be ready to make the hard call without it destroying you afterward. That evening, Reese sat alone in the chapel staring at a simple wooden cross on the wall. She thought about Sullivan sitting in an equipment shed with a pistol choosing oblivion over living with memories he couldn't reconcile. She thought about Kessler finding him having to lie to investigators, having to explain to his team why their medic was never coming back. She thought about Webb and his dead brother Sloan and his scar, all the accumulated weight of war that these men carried without ever putting down. Somewhere on base, someone played guitar, badly chords drifting through open windows on evening breeze. Life continued indifferent to questions of morality and purpose, reducing everything to simple survival. 3 days later, Kessler assembled the team for mission briefing. The conference room felt different now. Reese wasn't an outsider anymore. She was part of the machinery, another component in the complex system keeping these warriors alive and operational. Intelligence has identified a suspected weapons cache in Al-Hasaka. Kessler began pulling up satellite imagery on the display screen. Border town, contested territory, minimal civilian presence. Our job is routine reconnaissance. Eyes on target, confirm or deny, the cache extract clean. In and out, no contact unless absolutely necessary. He clicked through additional images, showing the target building from multiple angles. 3-story structure, formerly a textile factory now abandoned. Perfect for storage. We insert at 2300 hours observed through the night, extract at 0500 before morning prayers. Standard Overwatch protocol. Sloan studied the imagery with professional interest. Rules of engagement. Weapons tight unless fired upon. This is intelligence gathering, not direct action. We're shadows. They never know we were there. The briefing continued with mechanical precision. Entry routes, egress paths, communications protocols, contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. It was routine. Textbook. The kind of mission that shouldn't generate more than a paragraph in an after-action report. Reese listened to details, making mental notes about potential medical scenarios. Environmental injuries from Syrian heat. Dehydration protocols. What to do if someone took fire and couldn't be immediately evacuated. Her mind worked through scenarios with the same methodical approach Kessler used for tactical planning. She didn't know yet that in 72 hours she'd be holding Garrett Sloan's Barrett rifle with blood on her hands and impossible choices in front of her. She didn't know that the routine reconnaissance mission would become a desperate fight for survival, forcing her to cross lines she'd never imagined crossing. She didn't know that Lieutenant Commander Ethan Kessler was about to make the most unconventional decision of his career, one that would either save his team or destroy them all. All she knew was that somewhere in Syrian darkness, a weapons cache waited to be confirmed, and she was ready to do her job and bring her team home live. The Barrett mate 2A1 waited in the armory, cleaned and zeroed and ready for whatever came next. Syrian night swallowed them whole at 2300 hours. 8 shadows melted into darkness, like ghosts who'd never learned to exist in daylight. Reese moved through abandoned Al-Hasaka streets with her medical pack strapped tight against her spine, every sense heightened to razor awareness that came from knowing a single mistake could mean death. Lieutenant Commander Kessler led from point position, his movements economical and precise, decades of training compressed into muscle memory, requiring no conscious thought. Behind him, Sloan and Webb covered flanks, while Holt maintained communications. His radio equipment, a silent lifeline to extraction helicopters waiting 30 kilometers away. Reese stayed in the middle of formation, exactly where a medic should be, close enough to reach anyone who went down, but protected by operators who knew how to kill. The target building loomed against starlit sky, a 3-story monument to industrial collapse. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the smell of abandonment hung in air. That particular combination of dust and decay, marking places where human activity had ceased. Intelligence had described it as lightly defended, maybe 2 or 3 guards, at most a simple cache point for weapons moving through borderlands. What they found instead made Kessler's hand snap into a closed fist, the signal for immediate halt. Through night vision, Reese could see what had frozen the commander in place. The supposedly abandoned textile factory crawled with activity. 30 fighters, maybe more, moving with military precision that spoke of professional training rather than insurgent enthusiasm. Trucks were being unloaded, crates stacked with methodical care, defensive positions established with interlocking fields of fire. These weren't the usual ragtag militants they'd been tracking. These men moved like soldiers. "This is not what we signed up for," Holt muttered into his microphone voice, carrying the dark humor that helped operators cope with situations spiraling beyond control. Kessler's response came through their earpieces, calm, despite obvious intelligence failure. "Overlord, this is Viper 7. We have eyes on target. Situation does not match briefing parameters. Request immediate abort authorization." The radio crackled with static. Then a voice from the Tactical Operations Center confirmed what they already knew. "Viper 7 abort authorized. Collect available intelligence and extract clean. No engagement unless compromised." They began withdrawal with the same careful precision used on insertion, backing away from the compound while maintaining visual contact, photographing everything, building a picture of whatever operation was unfolding in that supposedly abandoned factory. Standard procedure, textbook execution. The kind of mission that should end with a detailed report and recommendations for follow-up action by someone else. The explosion that announced their discovery wasn't random. It was a coordinated detonation that brought down half the building they'd been using for observation, a controlled demolition turning their overwatch position into a 3-story death trap in the span of 3 seconds. Reese felt the world tilt sideways as the floor beneath her feet simply ceased to exist. She fell through darkness and dust, her body slamming into concrete that had no mercy for flesh and bone. Her medical pack absorbed some impact, but pain still shot through her left side like lightning ribs protesting the sudden violence of gravity reasserting control. Around her, the rest of the team was picking themselves up from similar falls night vision equipment, knocked loose tactical formations shattered into isolated pockets of confusion. The building groaned with structural damage, walls that had stood for decades now reduced to precarious towers of rubble, waiting for the slightest excuse to collapse completely. "Sound off!" Kessler's voice cut through ringing in her ears. One by one, the team reported in voices tight with pain, but functional. Nobody dead yet, though that could change in the next few seconds. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds began chewing chunks from masonry around them. Muzzle flashes lit up darkness from multiple directions as enemy fighters poured toward the collapsing building, their coordinated response confirming what Reese had already suspected. They'd been watched. The ambush had been deliberate. Someone had known they were coming and prepared a trap with cold efficiency of professionals who understood exactly how American special operations teams moved. "They knew we'd be here," Webb said, his voice carrying bitter realization that came from understanding you'd been played. This whole thing was a setup. Kessler was already moving his mind, processing tactical options with speed that separated veteran commanders from dead ones. Defensive positions. First and second floor are compromised. Third floor northwest corner. Move. They moved, combat crawling across debris-strewn floors while bullets traced deadly geometry through air above them. Reese kept her head down and her medical pack secure, every instinct screaming to find cover and stay there. But training overrode instinct. She had to stay with the team. A medic separated from her casualties was just another target. The third floor offered marginally better protection. Concrete walls thick enough to stop rifle rounds, windows positioned to provide overwatch on surrounding buildings. It was defensible for maybe 20 minutes, which was 19 minutes longer than Reese wanted to be anywhere near this collapsing structure. "Overlord, this is Viper 7. Kessler's voice remained steady despite chaos erupting around them. "We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Building is structurally compromised. Request immediate emergency extraction." The response came back through waves of static. "Viper 7, nearest QRF is 30 mics out. Air support available but needs positive ID on friendlies. Can you mark your position?" 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours. The enemy fighters weren't rushing the building in suicidal waves. They were setting up positions with tactical patience, establishing crossfire patterns, bringing up heavy weapons. Through shattered windows, Reese could see muzzle flashes from surrounding buildings as the trap closed with methodical precision. That's when Owen Holt made his mistake. The communications specialist moved to better cover a tactical shift that should have been routine, 3 steps across open space that would improve his firing position. The bullet caught him mid-stride, punching through his left thigh with the wet impact of high-velocity metal meeting human flesh. He went down hard and Reese saw the arterial spray before her conscious mind could process what it meant. Femoral artery. Maybe 3 minutes before he bled out completely. Holtz hit. The words came from somewhere, maybe her own mouth, she wasn't sure. Training took over before conscious thought could interfere, her body moving with practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment. She low-crawled across 20 feet of debris-strewn floor, while tracer rounds painted deadly streaks through the smoke-filled air above her head. Bullets chewed concrete inches from her position, close enough that she could feel pressure waves, but stopping meant Holt died, and she'd come too far to let that happen. He was propped against a wall when she reached him, blood spreading across his tactical pants in a pattern that made her stomach drop. The bullet had punched through muscle and found the main artery, and now his life was pumping out onto Syrian dust with every heartbeat. "Stay with me, Holt." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, applying pressure while digging through her medical kit for a tourniquet. The world had narrowed to tunnel vision, nothing existing except the wound and the steps needed to stop it. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to keep talking to me." "Feels like someone hit me with a sledgehammer," he gasped, his face already pale from blood loss. His eyes had that distant look that came with shock setting in, the body's desperate attempt to protect itself from understanding the full extent of damage. Reese got the tourniquet in place and tightened it with mechanical precision, twisting the windlass until bleeding stopped, her hands steady despite pandemonium erupting around them. She started an IV line to replace fluids. He'd lost her movements, automatic years of training, compressed into actions requiring no thought. Around them, the firefight intensified. Webb and Kessler were laying down, suppressing fire, their M4 carbines hammering controlled bursts at targets Reese couldn't see. Sloan had taken up position near a window, his Barrett rifle tracking movement in surrounding buildings, waiting for shots that mattered. For just a moment, as Reese worked on Holt's wound, she looked up and saw something that made her blood freeze. In uncertain light filtering through smoke and dust, Holt's face seemed to shift, features blurring and reforming into someone else's. Aaron Sullivan stared back at her with dead eyes, his expression carrying the weight of every patient he'd tried to save and lost, every decision that had slowly crushed him under accumulated guilt. Her hands began to shake. It was stress, she knew that intellectually. Combat-induced hallucination, the brain's desperate attempt to process overwhelming sensory input by connecting it to stored trauma. Sullivan was dead, had been dead for 3 months, was never coming back, no matter how many times his ghost appeared in her peripheral vision. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things entirely. "Donovan," Kessler's voice cut through the hallucination like a knife through silk. "Is he stable?" The image of Sullivan dissolved back into Holt's pain-contorted face. Reality reasserted itself with brutal clarity. Reese checked the tourniquet, confirmed the IV was flowing properly, assessed for additional injuries she might have missed in initial chaos. "Stable for now," she reported, her voice steadier than she felt. "But he needs surgical intervention within the hour or he loses the leg." "Noted. Stay with him." 30 seconds later, the RPG hit. The explosion against the exterior wall sent a shockwave through the building that knocked Reese flat. Her ears rang with sudden silence that felt more wrong than any amount of noise. Concrete dust filled the air in choking clouds, and for a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't do anything except exist in gray limbo between conscious thought and animal panic. When her hearing returned, she heard Garrett Sloan screaming. Not in pain, though there was plenty of that in his voice. He was screaming in rage, the sound of a professional warrior watching his career end in the span of a single heartbeat. The shrapnel from the blast had mangled his right shoulder, his shooting arm hanging useless at his side, while blood soaked through his tactical vest in expanding circles of dark wetness. "My arm!" Sloan shouted, more frustrated than afraid, the fury of a man who understood exactly what he'd lost. "I can't feel my goddamn arm." Reese scrambled to his position, her medical assessment revealing the worst possible scenario for a sniper. The shrapnel had severed nerves and torn through muscle, potentially ending a career built over 15 years of dedicated service. The damage was catastrophic, the kind of injury that might save the limb, but would never restore the microscopic precision required for long-range shooting. She worked frantically to control bleeding, applying pressure bandages while assessing nerve damage, her hands moving with automatic precision even as her mind raced through implications. Sloan's Barrett rifle lay beside him, precision-engineered death that suddenly had no one qualified to use it. The weapon that could reach out 400 meters and change the tactical situation with a single shot now sat useless because the only man trained to wield it had been reduced to a one-armed liability. "Overlord, this is Viper 7. Kessler's voice had taken on an urgency she'd never heard from him before. We have 2 urgent surgical casualties and need immediate dust-off. How copy? The response crackled back through static and distance. Viper 7 nearest support is 20 mics out. Can you hold your position? 20 minutes. Reese finished applying the pressure bandage to Sloane's shoulder and looked around at their desperate situation. Holt was stable but couldn't fight. Sloane was down, his dominant arm destroyed. That left 4 effective shooters against 30-plus enemies with superior positioning and weapons that were systematically tearing their refuge apart. Through the chaos of treating 2 critically wounded teammates, Reese noticed something that made her blood run cold. The enemy fire had shifted from random suppression to coordinated, methodical targeting. Through shattered windows, she could see muzzle flashes from surrounding buildings as fighters moved with tactical precision, setting up interlocking fields of fire. "They're not just trying to pin us down," she called out to Kessler as she worked on Sloane's shoulder. "They're setting up for a final assault." Kessler's response was interrupted by the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle, and Marcus Webb dropped behind cover as a bullet shattered concrete where his head had been a second before. "Sniper in the minaret," Webb reported, pointing toward a mosque 400 meters away. "He's got overwatch on our entire position." That's when Reese saw the real problem. The enemy sniper wasn't just taking random shots. He had a spotter feeding him targets, and together they were systematically eliminating anyone who tried to return fire or move to better positions. Every time one of the SEALs tried to engage fighters in surrounding buildings, the sniper would force them back into cover with precision fire that spoke of professional training and intimate knowledge of how American operators moved. "We're trapped," Holt said from his position against the wall, speaking what everyone was thinking. His voice was weak from blood loss, but his tactical assessment was sound. "That sniper's got us locked down, and those fighters are going to rush us any minute." Sloane tried to lift his Barrett with his good left arm, but the massive rifle was too heavy for one-handed operation, especially with his dominant shooting arm hanging useless. The frustration in his eyes was heartbreaking. He was watching his teammates face an impossible situation, while his own weapon, the one tool that could change everything, sat beside him like a monument to capability lost. Through smoke and bunt, Reese caught Kessler's eye. The SEAL commander was calculating odds, weighing options, running through tactical scenarios with speed that came from 2 decades of combat experience. She could see him reaching the same conclusion she had. They were running out of time and running out of choices. The sound of boots on concrete echoed from the stairwell below them. The final assault was beginning with inexorable patience of men who knew their prey was cornered. Kessler combat crawled across the debris-strewn floor to her position, his face grim with the weight of an impossible decision. Behind him, Webb and the remaining operators were laying down suppressing fire, but their ammunition was running dangerously low, each magazine bringing them closer to the moment when shooting stopped and hand-to-hand combat began in confined spaces that favored numbers over skill. "Donovan!" His voice cut through gunfire with the kind of authority that made everything else fade into background noise. "I need you to take Sloane's rifle." Reese looked up from checking Holt's IV line, certain she'd misheard him over the chaos. Sir, Kessler's eyes cold and clear, as Arctic meltwater locked onto hers with an intensity that made the world contract to just the 2 of them, commander and medic, having a conversation that would define everything that came next. "That sniper in the minaret is the key to everything. Take him out and we can break their coordination. But Sloane can't make the shot, and I need every other rifle covering our flanks." She glanced at the massive Barrett M8 2A1 lying beside Sloane. She'd qualified expert marksman with it 3 weeks ago, had grown up hunting mule deer in Montana mountains, with her grandfather understood the fundamentals of long-range shooting in ways most people never would. But this was different. This wasn't a paper target or even a deer at 200 yards. This was a trained enemy sniper at 412 meters who was actively trying to kill her teammates, and missing meant everyone in this building died in the next 10 minutes. "Sir, I can't." The words came out smaller than she intended, but they were honest. "I'm a medic. I save lives. I've never killed anyone." Kessler's expression shifted something like understanding, mixing with the brutal calculation of a commander out of options. "I know, and under any other circumstances I wouldn't ask, but there's something you need to understand about this mission, Donovan." He glanced at the window, then back to her. "That intelligence officer who briefed us, he pulled me aside before we left. Told me this wasn't just a reconnaissance mission. Command suspected we had a leak, someone feeding our operations to Iranian intelligence. This whole thing was a trap to confirm it. We were bait." Reese felt her blood turn to ice. "You knew we were walking into an ambush." "I knew it was possible. I thought we could handle it." Kessler's jaw tightened. I was wrong, and now my team is paying for my mistakes. Holt's bleeding out. Sloane's career is over. If you don't take that shot, we all die here, and it'll be because I made a command decision that sacrificed you all to catch a traitor. The confession hung between them like a physical thing. This wasn't just about tactical necessity anymore. It was about a commander who'd gambled with his team's lives and lost, and was now asking his medic to save them by crossing a line she'd spent her entire career trying to stay on the right side of. The spotters feeding him targets from the balcony. Kessler continued pointing through the shattered window toward the mosque where she could barely make out two figures. Take him out first. Without his eyes, the sniper is just another shooter. Then put one through the sniper position. You've got maybe 30 seconds before they zero in on our exact location. Sloane tried to protest through gritted teeth, his professional pride warring with the reality of his mangled shoulder. Commander, I can still hold that rifle steady enough with one arm. I can make... Chief, you know you can't. Kessler's voice carried brutal honesty. That combat demanded the kind of truth that ignored ego and focused on capability. Donovan has the steadiest hands on this team and the best eyes for detail. If anyone can make this shot, it's her. Reese felt the weight of every eye in the room settling on her shoulders like physical pressure. Webb bleeding from a dozen small cuts, but still functional, his face showing desperate hope of someone watching their last option materialize. Holt pale from blood loss, but conscious enough to understand what was being asked. Sloane devastated by his injury, but professional enough to recognize that Kessler was right. Her hands were shaking. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, taste copper fear on her tongue, hear her grandfather's voice from 15 years ago teaching a 12-year-old girl the fundamentals of marksmanship in high country before dawn. Marksmanship is precision medicine applied at distance, Reese. Same steady hands, same controlled breathing, same focus on the target. You remove what needs removing, and you don't think about it until the job is done. But her grandfather had been talking about deer, not human beings. Animals that existed as food sources and population management, not fathers and sons and husbands who would leave empty spaces at dinner tables when they didn't come home. Donovan, Sloane's voice rough with pain, but carrying a note she'd never heard from him before, something like trust mixed with desperate need. You've got this. I've watched you shoot. Your form is better than mine was at your age. The fundamentals are all there. You just need to trust them. The Barrett felt impossibly heavy when she lifted it, every ounce seeming to represent a choice. She was making a line, she was crossing a person she was becoming. The scope was already zeroed for Sloane's shooting style, and she'd have to adjust for her own body mechanics in the middle of a firefight, compensate for differences in height and arm length, and a dozen other variables that separated adequate shooting from precision work. She moved to the window using concrete rubble as a shooting rest while staying low enough to avoid the enemy sniper's line of sight. Through the scope, the minaret jumped into sharp focus, and she could see the spotter clearly now, a bearded man in military fatigues using binoculars to direct the sniper's fire with calm professionalism. The sniper himself was partially concealed behind stone balustrade, only his rifle barrel and the edge of his scope visible. Range is 412 meters, Webb called out, having used his laser rangefinder. Wind is negligible, but you've got maybe 15 seconds before they spot your position. 15 seconds to make a decision that would define everything that came after. 15 seconds to cross a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. 15 seconds to choose between the person she was and the person this moment demanded she become. Reese settled into her shooting position, feeling the familiar ritual of marksmanship take over. Controlled breathing, natural point of aim, sight picture, trigger control. The same fundamentals her grandfather had drilled into her during countless hunting trips now applied to the deadliest game of all. The Barrett's reticle settled on the spotter's center mass, and she began her breathing cycle, feeling her heart rate slow despite adrenaline flooding her system, her hands steadying, despite the tremor that had threatened to make the rifle unusable. Somewhere behind her, Kessler was giving orders, repositioning the remaining shooters, preparing for whatever came next. But his voice had faded into background noise, meaningless sound that couldn't penetrate the bubble of focus separating her from everything except the man in her crosshairs. 412 meters, a distance that turned human beings into targets that reduced moral complexity to simple geometry and ballistics. Far enough that she couldn't see his eyes, couldn't know if he was smiling or afraid, couldn't imagine the life that would end when her finger moved a quarter inch. Her grandfather's voice echoed one final time. When it matters, you don't think. You just do what needs doing and sort out your feelings later. Reese's finger found the trigger. The world held its breath. The rifle discharged with a violence that shocked her nervous system. Reese had fired the Barrett during training, had felt its recoil, and heard its report in the controlled environment of a range. But this was different. The weapon slammed back into her shoulder with enough force to bruise bone, the muzzle blast creating a pressure wave that rippled through the air like a physical thing. For a heartbeat, the world existed only as white noise and the acrid smell of burnt powder. Through the scope, she watched her bullet strike stone 6 inches left of the spotter's position. Close, but not close enough. The enemy sniper's rifle swung immediately toward their building, his training overriding any surprise at being engaged. She could see the dark circle of his scope searching for her position, his movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who understood that the first person to acquire target in a sniper duel was usually the only person who survived it. The spotter was shouting into a radio, his voice carrying across 400 meters of Syrian night as he called out her location to the assault teams below. In her peripheral vision, Reese could see enemy fighters adjusting positions, preparing to concentrate fire on the window where she'd just exposed herself. She had seconds, maybe less. Working the bolt felt like moving through molasses, every action requiring conscious thought when there was no time for thinking. Chamber another round. Adjust point of aim. Compensate for the miss. The scope's reticle settled on the spotter's center mass again, and this time she held her breath at the natural respiratory pause, that moment between exhale and inhale where the body achieves perfect stillness. She applied pressure to the trigger with the same gentle precision she'd used threading a needle through damaged tissue. The second shot found its mark. The .50 caliber round struck the spotter high in the chest, and the impact was catastrophic. His body jerked backward from the balcony in a spray of blood that painted white stone, his form tumbling through space with the loose-limbed quality of something that had stopped being human and become physics. Reese saw it all through the scope, saw the moment of impact, saw the body fall, saw the way a human life ended when high-velocity metal met flesh. Her stomach lurched, but her hands stayed steady. Not from courage, from the same muscle memory that kept trauma surgeons functioning during emergency procedures, the ability to compartmentalize, to separate the emotional reality from the mechanical necessity, to finish the job before allowing yourself to feel. The enemy sniper's head snapped toward where his spotter had been standing a second before. Human reaction overrode tactical training as he tried to process what had just happened, tried to understand how his partner had been there and then wasn't, and in that moment of distraction, Reese was already working the bolt for her third shot. The sniper realized his danger. She could see him trying to swing his rifle back toward her position, his movements carrying the urgency of someone who understood they'd made a fatal mistake. But he was too late. Reese's third round punched through the stone balustrade and found him behind it. The massive bullet carried enough kinetic energy to defeat cover that would have stopped conventional rifle rounds. The enemy sniper collapsed forward, his weapon clattering against stone, his threat permanently neutralized. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, broken only by ringing in her ears and the sound of her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. "Holy hell, Donovan!" Kessler's voice cut through the aftermath, carrying a note of amazement she'd never heard from him before. Clean kills, both of them. But she wasn't finished. With the sniper eliminated, she could see the bigger picture of the battle unfolding below, and her mind was no longer thinking like a medic following orders. She was thinking tactically, independently, seeing the battlefield the way Commander saw it. The enemy assault teams had lost their overwatch, but they were still advancing, still dangerous. More critically, she spotted the heavy machine gun position that had been keeping their extraction helicopters at bay, a PKM team set up in a second-floor window of the building across the courtyard, the distinctive profile of the Russian-designed weapon, unmistakable even at distance. Without hesitation, without orders, without conscious thought about crossing further lines, Reese shifted her aim. "Donovan, what are you?" Kessler started. The fourth round from the Barrett punched through sandbags protecting the PKM team. The gunner simply disappeared from view, the crew-served weapon going silent mid-burst. She worked the bolt again. Fifth round. A mortar team setting up in an adjacent building scattered as the round impacted near their position, their attempt at indirect fire support abandoned. "She's not following orders," Webb said, his voice carrying something like awe mixed with disbelief. "She's running the whole damn battlefield." Kessler was already on the radio, his assessment of the tactical situation changing in real time. "Overlord, this is Viper 7. Sniper threat is neutralized. Heavy weapons are down. We are ready for immediate dust-off." The distinctive thump of helicopter rotor blades cut through Syrian darkness like salvation arriving on schedule. Reese finally lowered the rifle, and the adrenaline that had been keeping her functional began to crash. Her hands started shaking, small tremors at first, then violent enough that she had to set the Barrett down before she dropped it. She'd fired 5 rounds, eliminated 5 targets, changed the tactical situation with precision that veteran snipers spent careers trying to achieve. But the cost of that precision was written in blood on a minaret 400 meters away, and she could still see the spotter's body tumbling through space, could still see the moment of impact frozen in her memory, like a photograph she'd never be able to burn. Sloan appeared beside her, his good arm reaching out to steady her as helicopters touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash. The wounded sniper looked at her with something approaching reverence, mixed with recognition of a truth she was only beginning to understand. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, Doc," he managed through pain. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" "My grandfather." The words felt hollow, inadequate to explain how hunting elk in Montana mountains had somehow prepared her to kill human beings in Syrian darkness. "He taught me well." The flight medic helped load Holt and Sloan into the helicopter, their injuries requiring immediate surgical intervention. Reese moved through the motions of handoff and transfer with automatic precision, checking IV lines and monitoring vitals. But her mind was still in that building, still looking through the scope, still seeing the spotter fall. "Outstanding work, Corpsman," the flight medic shouted over the helicopter's engines as they lifted off. But his words felt distant, in surreal praise being offered to someone else for something that had happened in a different lifetime. Through the aircraft's window, she could see the minaret where her targets had fallen, already swarming with enemy fighters who'd arrived too late to matter. The tactical situation that had seemed so desperate 30 minutes ago was now just another mission in the books, another set of coordinates on a map marking where American operators had survived against impossible odds. But Reese knew something fundamental had changed in those moments behind the Barrett's scope. The line between healer and killer had been crossed, and there was no going back to the person she'd been before she'd pulled that trigger. The debriefing at the forward operating base was unlike anything she'd experienced. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, studied her with the calculating gaze of a career officer who'd seen enough combat to recognize something exceptional when it crossed his desk. "Corpsman Donovan, you're aware that what you accomplished today is going to generate some significant attention." His voice carried careful neutrality of someone delivering news that could be interpreted multiple ways. A medic taking out enemy snipers with a .50 caliber rifle isn't exactly standard operating procedure. "I was just doing my job, sir," Reese replied, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Her job was to keep people alive, not to kill enemy combatants at 400 meters. But in that moment, those two responsibilities had become the same thing, and she still wasn't sure how to reconcile the contradiction. Kessler's after-action report was clinical in its precision, but she could see the other team members exchanging glances as he described her shooting. "Corpsman Donovan eliminated 3 high-value targets at extended range under extreme combat conditions. Additionally, she independently identified and neutralized 2 crew-served weapon positions that were preventing air support. Her actions directly enabled the successful extraction of the team and prevented what would have been a catastrophic tactical situation." The paperwork that followed was a bureaucratic avalanche: witness statements, ballistics reports, tactical assessments, all painting the same picture of a Navy corpsman who'd performed at the level of an elite sniper when her team's survival depended on it. That night, alone in her quarters, Reese lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling and waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the spotter tumbling from the balcony, his body reduced to physics and trajectory, a human life ending in the time it took a bullet to travel 400 meters. She wondered if he had a family, children who would grow up without a father, a wife who would receive notification that her husband had been killed in action, his body shattered by a weapon designed to destroy equipment rather than people, parents who would bury a son and never know the face of the woman who'd killed him. The rational part of her mind understood that he'd been trying to kill her teammates, that his death had saved American lives, that the moral calculus of combat made such choices necessary. But the human part of her mind, the part that had spent years training to heal rather than harm, couldn't quite reconcile the mathematics. Around 0300, she gave up on sleep and walked to the aid station, thinking work might quiet the thoughts racing through her head. But when she tried to practice a V insertion on a training dummy, her hands shook so badly she couldn't thread the needle. The steady hands that had fired 5 perfect shots under combat stress couldn't manage routine medical procedures in the safety of a base hospital. She called her father from a satellite phone in the communications center, needing to hear a voice that remembered who she'd been before she'd become someone who could kill with surgical precision. "Dad," her voice cracked on the single-syllable years of practiced emotional control dissolving into something raw and wounded. "Reese, what's wrong?" Her father's voice carried the rough concern of a Montana rancher who'd raised a daughter to be tough but still recognized when toughness wasn't enough. Are you hurt? I killed 3 people today. The words tumbled out in a rush, needing to be spoken aloud to someone who might understand. I'm supposed to be a medic. I'm supposed to heal. But I picked up a rifle and I killed them, and I can't stop seeing their faces. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that she wondered if the connection had dropped. Then her father's voice came back, carrying weight that only another veteran could truly understand. Your grandfather came back from Korea different than he left, he said quietly. Didn't talk about it much, but sometimes late at night, he'd sit on the porch and just stare at nothing. Said the killing was necessary, but that didn't make it easy. Said the men who did it and felt nothing were the ones you had to worry about. How did he live with it? By coming back, by being there for his family, by teaching his granddaughter to shoot straight and think clearly and do what needed doing when it mattered. Her father's voice carried the kind of wisdom that came from watching someone struggle with demons and survive. You did your job, Reese. You kept your people alive. That's what matters. The rest you learn to carry. I don't know if I can carry this. You can, because the alternative is Sullivan and I won't lose you like they lost him. The words hit harder than she expected, forcing her to confront the choice that had been lurking beneath the surface since she'd arrived in Syria. She could let the weight of what she'd done crush her the way it had crushed Sullivan, or she could find a way to integrate it into who she was to become someone who could live with the burden, rather than being destroyed by it. Within a week, word had reached the Pentagon. Within 2 weeks, Reese found herself sitting across from Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Dunn, a career Special Operations Corpsman whose file read like a greatest hits of America's Shadow Wars. The Special Operations Combat Medic Program is looking for candidates with your particular skill set. Dunn explained, her expression neutral, but her eyes carrying the assessment of someone who'd already decided Reese was worth recruiting. It's a 2-year pipeline that would qualify you for assignment with any Special Operations unit in the military. SEAL Teams, Delta Force Rangers, they're all looking for medics who can operate at their level. Reese had heard whispers about the SOCM program, rumors of a selection process so brutal, the washout rate exceeded 60% of training that combined advanced medical procedures with combat skills rivaling those of the operators they supported. It was a path that would take her far from conventional Navy medicine into a world where the line between healer and warrior became increasingly blurred. There's something else. Dunn slid a folder across the desk, her movements carrying deliberate precision of someone delivering news that required careful handling. Your actions in Syria have been submitted for the Silver Star. The recommendation is already working its way through channels, and given the witness statements, in tactical impact approval is likely. The Silver Star. The third highest military decoration for valor in combat, a recognition reserved for those who distinguish themselves through gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Reese stared at the folder, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. 6 months ago, she'd been just another Navy corpsman, competent but unremarkable. Now she was being offered a path to the most elite levels of military medicine, marked with a medal that would identify her as someone who'd proven herself under the ultimate test. I don't want it, she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. I don't want a medal for killing people. That's not who I am. Dunn's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been understanding. That's exactly why they're offering it to you. Because you understand the cause, because you didn't take those shots lightly. Because you're someone who can be trusted with that kind of responsibility precisely because you don't want it. She paused, then leaned forward slightly. But there's something else you should know. The investigation into the intelligence leak that compromised your mission. It's been resolved. They found the traitor, a contractor working in the TOC, who'd been feeding operational details to Iranian intelligence for 6 months. Your mission confirmed the leak existed. The ambush you survived gave them the evidence they needed to identify and arrest him. Reese felt her breath catch. So Kessler was right. We were bait. You were bait. And it worked. Because of what happened in Al-Hasaka, dozens of future operations won't be compromised. Hundreds of American lives that would have been at risk are now safe. Dunn's voice carried absolute certainty. Sullivan died never knowing if his sacrifices mattered. You have the chance to know that yours did. The words settled into Reese's chest like stones, heavy but solid. The choice crystallized with sudden clarity. She could refuse the recognition and let what she'd done in Syria become just another classified incident buried in Pentagon archives. Or she could accept it and use it as foundation for something larger than herself. But it was Kessler's visit 3 days later that finally convinced her to accept the challenge. The SEAL commander appeared in her quarters carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of expression that suggested this wasn't an official conversation. "I've been thinking about what happened out there," he said, settling into the plastic chair across from her small desk. "About the decision to give you that rifle." Reese wrapped her hands around the coffee, grateful for warmth despite Syrian heat outside. "Sir, I've been thinking about it too. I'm not sure I made the right choice. You saved my team." His voice carried absolute certainty, the kind of conviction that came from watching people day and survey and understanding the difference. Holt would be dead, Webb would be dead, Sloan and I would have gone down fighting, and you'd have died trying to save us because that's who you are. Instead, we all came home. That's the only metric that matters in combat. He paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. "You know what convinced me it was the right call? It wasn't your marksmanship scores or your hunting background. It was watching you work on Holt and Sloan under fire. The way you stayed calm, the way you prioritized, the way you saw the bigger picture, even while you were focused on saving lives. Those are leadership qualities, Donovan. Command presence, the kind of instincts that can't be taught. I'm a medic, sir, not a leader. You're both now, whether you accept it or not." Kessler leaned forward, his eyes carrying the weight of 15 years watching operators evolve and break, and sometimes transcend their limitations. The SOCM program isn't just about creating better medics. It's about developing leaders who can operate at the highest levels of special operations. People who can make life and death decisions in impossible situations and live with the consequences afterward. Sullivan couldn't live with them. Sullivan tried to carry everything alone. He thought asking for help was weakness, that processing trauma was failure, that the cost of war should be borne in silence. Kessler's voice had gone quiet, carrying the kind of pain that came from watching someone you cared about destroy themselves. What you did with that Barrett wasn't just good shooting. It was tactical thinking under pressure. It was leadership when leadership mattered most. It was choosing to become what the moment demanded rather than breaking under the weight of impossible choices. He stood up, preparing to leave. Accept the Silver Star, complete the SOCM program, become the kind of leader who can help the next generation avoid Sullivan's fate. That's how you honor what happened in that building, not by refusing recognition, but by using it to prevent other medics from having to learn these lessons the hard way. 6 months later, Reese stood in the humid Georgia heat at Fort Bragg, one of 32 candidates beginning the SSOCM selection course. The training was everything she'd been warned about, and worse, 18-hour days combining advanced trauma medicine with weapons training, small unit tactics, and psychological evaluations designed to break anyone who wasn't absolutely committed to the path they'd chosen. But every time the instructors pushed her to her breaking point, she remembered that moment in the Syrian building when Kessler had trusted her with his team's lives. She remembered the weight of the Barrett and the knowledge that her teammates were counting on her to make an impossible shot. Most of all, she remembered the look in Sloan's eyes when she'd handed his rifle back after extraction, not just gratitude, but recognition that she belonged in their world. The training was brutal, but she'd learned something in Syria that many of her fellow candidates hadn't. She'd learned that she could cross lines she'd never imagined crossing and still be herself on the other side. That understanding made all the difference. 18 months later, newly promoted Petty Officer First Class Reese Donovan received her SOCM qualification and her first assignment to SEAL Team 6. The Silver Star ceremony had been a formal affair, attended by Navy brass and her proud parents, but it was the quiet moment afterward that meant the most to her. Kessler, now a full commander with his own team, pulled her aside with a simple observation that would stay with her for the rest of her career. "You know what the real lesson is from that day in Syria?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of wisdom that came from surviving long enough to understand what survival cost. "Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Don't ever let them forget that, Donovan. And don't ever forget it yourself." 3 years after Syria, Reese stood in front of a classroom of junior combat medics at Fort Bragg, teaching the next generation the lessons she'd learned in Blood and Fire. The Barrett M8-2A1 sat on a table beside her, cleaned and maintained with the reverence it deserved. "This rifle saved my team," she told the students, her hands resting on the weapon that had changed everything. "It also changed who I am. Both things are true, and you need to understand that before you ever pick up a weapon in combat." She looked at their young faces, seeing the mixture of eagerness and uncertainty she'd once carried, remembering what it felt like to believe that healing and killing were separate things rather than two sides of the same terrible coin. "You're going to be asked to make impossible choices, to cross lines you never imagined crossing, to become someone you didn't plan on becoming. Her voice carried the weight of experience earned in Syrian darkness. And when that moment comes, you'll have two options. You can let it break you, like it broke too many of the people who came before us, or you can find a way to integrate it to become someone who can carry the weight without being crushed by it. She picked up the Barrett, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the recoil and the scope, and the moment when she'd chosen to become what the situation demanded. I chose to carry it. Every single day I make that choice again, because the alternative is giving up, and I won't dishonor the people who trusted me by giving up. She set the rifle back down with gentle precision. You'll make your own choice when the time comes. Just make sure it's one you can live with, because you'll be living with it for the rest of your life. In the back of the room, Kessler watched from the doorway, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. The medic who'd picked up his chief's rifle in a collapsing building had become the instructor who could teach others to survive what had broken so many before them. After the class, Reese returned to her office and found a message waiting. Garrett Sloan had been medically retired with full honors, his shoulder having healed enough to function, but never enough to shoot. He'd started teaching marksmanship to junior SEALs, passing on the expertise he could no longer demonstrate. Marcus Webb had completed financial counseling through the Navy's support programs, his brother's debt cleared, and his career back on track. Owen Holt had recovered from his leg injury with only a slight limp to show for it and had just been promoted to senior chief. They'd all survived. They'd all found ways to carry what had happened in Al-Hasaka without being destroyed by it. Sullivan's ghost had finally been laid to rest, replaced by something stronger. An understanding that healing and killing weren't opposites, but parallel responsibilities, that leadership meant carrying impossible burdens without being crushed by them, that the cost of war could be borne without becoming its victim. Reese Donovan had learned to live with what she'd done in Syria, not by forgetting it or justifying it or pretending it didn't matter, but by accepting that sometimes saving lives required taking them, and that both actions demanded the same steady hands and focused mind. The Barrett sat silent in the classroom, a monument to choices made and costs paid, waiting for the next person who would need to understand that distance didn't make killing easier. It just made it possible to survive what came after.